In one case, I was in a cold and very repetitive data center in Fremont, California. In the other case, I was returning a shelf to an Ikea in Paramus, New Jersey. In both cases, I had time to meditate on industrial-level storage and presentation, and how those different philosophies play a part in quality of life, and how we maybe all should think a little more about it. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood, Daniel Boyd, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. In the case of Fremont, California, I was at one of the data centers of Hurricane Electric, a data center company based in California with some of the largest data centers that you can rent a rack in. I was there because Diskmaster was finally making a return. There's a machine that was purchased for Diskmaster, and it wasn't quite clear where it was going to be hosted. Internet Archive seemed like a pretty good idea, but it's a machine that would be administrated separately, would have its own rules and security, and it just, after a while, seemed like a bad fit. So, thanks to some generous donors and some time, the machine was transferred to Fremont and installed in a rack. I was doing it with some very old friends who I've known for decades, who happen to have a rack at Hurricane Electric, and so the Diskmaster machine was carefully placed in the rack, secured, run with network and power, and then brought to life, where it began the process of rebuilding itself through 40 terabytes of data. This is less about diskmaster.textfiles.com, which is its own subject, and really what it was like for me to go into a data center of this size. There were people who were running the front desk who escorted us through a variety of locked doors, down a number of rows, with each row having its own massive, redundant UPS. And then we were left there to do the work we needed, under the steady gaze of a camera up and down the different rows. My friends were smart. They had 2 beach chairs inside of the rack, which we laid out and sat in while we went through the slow process of making sure every part of the machine had been secure through the transport before turning it on. This brought back memories. When I was a system administrator, I had my own data center I was in charge of, with its own white floor and loud noise from all of the fans. We had cages around the racks, huge perforated walls that were surrounding each of these racks, in which you had to have an individual key to get into. At one point, working with the company that owned my company, I had to visit yet another data center because they were in the business of a content delivery network, Sandpiper Networks, which ultimately had to have a rack in almost every competing data center as well as our own to ensure the shortest route to whatever customer was downloading what. If you've never dealt with content delivery networks on the back end, think of it as a series of buckets where there's water coming from the large tank down to smaller and smaller buckets until you end up near someone's house. So you always have some amount of water right near the customer. Faster, quicker, easier to get to. This is how, when you go to some sites, it appears to be ridiculously fast to get your data. It's a content delivery network. In my work with system administration, I got to see how other data centers worked. Data centers with their own approach to hosting a machine. If you're not familiar with the term 19-inch rack, well, just think of it as 2 bars with screw holes in them that are 19 inches apart, and almost every major piece of networking and computer equipment measures across about 19 inches, so you can place them into a rack. When you see what looks like a pile of machines, well, that's a rack. And when you think of where that rack goes, it goes in a cabinet or a box. And when you think about where that box goes, it goes inside of a data center. At Hurricane Electric, I was able to see the modern era of straightforward, non-homogeneous hosting. And what I saw was that people have it pretty locked down. The process enabled us to do the work we were doing without disturbing the other customers. We were able to test Diskmaster and, using a small portable screen, see what it was saying and make sure in every way that we could get to it from the outside world before closing it all up and going home. It was great to see my friends doing what they do best, logging in and using all sorts of commands to ensure the network was there. For one shining moment, it was 3 of us using our decades of experience to make sure that everything was going to work and upon a power cycle would come back exactly like we expected. In the case of IKEA, there was a shelf purchased. The shelf had a problem. One of the grommets wasn't working, and so another shelf was bought elsewhere. So this IKEA shelf wasn't needed, and I made the drive to Paramus, New Jersey, to the IKEA that was there. And I've been to IKEA many times, but maybe it's age, maybe it's understanding how hard it is to maintain things. But the industrial layout of IKEA, where, if you think about it, there are workers and there are customers, and then there are customers imitating workers at any given time. The workers know their job, they're trained, they clean things up, they rearrange things, they answer questions, they process information and physical items, they arrange for deliveries or picking things up. And then the customers are walking through these showrooms making decisions about what would look good in their home. They're saying, I like this sofa, this chair, I would like 5 of these lights. And then there's this hybrid customer, somebody who actually picks up the boxes and takes them back to their car. They go through a warehouse that has been designed to be used by workers, customers who have never been there before. The tags on the items tell you which aisle and which area each of these parts is. You pick them up, it has instructions, you bring them to the cashiers, and then you bring them to your car. Throughout this area that I was walking through, I was struck by how good the lighting was, how wide open the hallways were, how it seemed really clear that when they had designed these hybrid spaces, money wasn't really an object. Of course, the design was meant to save money where it was necessary, but there weren't shortcuts, attempts to do things that would save a little money in the building, but end up being dozens and dozens of terrible experiences for everyone going forward. There were redundant elevators and staircases. There were signs everywhere, in both icons and written text in various languages. And there were massive signs that would tell you where something was in a way that you could immediately see. When I got onto the property, in my car, I wondered where returns or exchanges were, and glowing at the end of one of the parking lots was that sign. Returns and exchanges. You went over, you parked your car, you grabbed a cart, brought it upstairs, and there was returns and exchanges. They had benches after you put your name in where you could sit and wait for your turn. In some ways, this all sounds logical. And when good design comes into place, it just feels like it should have always been this way. But that's not always the case. I spend a lot of time in New York City, and part of New York City is having these doorways underneath bodegas and stores. And you can clearly see a century of attempts to make something into something it's not, to have these small conveyor belts that barely hold boxes and somebody sweating in the basement as people throw boxes down these conveyor belts to be stacked. From there, they go up small, rickety ladders that people learn by heart to be able to bring them into the stores. It is clearly hard work, unpleasant, and none of it designed for human comfort or happiness. And over the years, it adds up. It adds up to broken bodies. It adds up to sprained wrists and ankles. It adds up to tripping, to getting caught or cut. And over time, the human damage becomes just another part of the calculation. At the furthest end of that, I have to mention the mango spam. When I got some spam asking if I wanted some mangoes, I was in a mood, and I said, sure, I would love to get mangoes. Tell me more. And they sent me pictures from the factory floor. And looking at these other experiences that I've seen, it was, in some ways, meant to impress me how much mango they were doing. But this back room in an Indian coast town was full of barefoot workers smoking, packaging, and putting together mangoes, clearly setting themselves up for untold amounts of injury, of distress, of sudden changes in the environment that could result in mistakes or even deadly problems, even though they were proud to show me what they had. What they had was danger personified. When I was young, I would go through places like Crazy Eddie's or Bradley's or Sam Goody Music, and I would just experience it as a young customer. Things were piled up because it was natural for them to be. I would see different displays and assume that's how things came. And only with the passage of decades have I now looked at all of these environments and realized how many human decisions made them become what they are. The environment that I work in, that I record podcasts in, that I do disc imaging and VHS digitization, as well as streaming and having conversations, is an environment that I built myself, and it has its shortcuts, its small areas that I have to turn to get into. And it was in one of these situations where one day I turned and it hurt way too much. There was my first real back spasm from arthritis and other problems I had brought on to myself over the years. Maybe it's a little bit too late. Maybe it's something I should have done years ago. But I feel that understanding why things are put together and the reasoning behind them, and trying to maintain the approach that making things a little easier at the cost of a little more money or a little more space will pay dividends that don't just end and begin with money for a long time to come. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bequanu, Mark Pilgrim, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Martin, Symbionts, Benjamin Guts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. In many ways, the damage I seem to have on my back, the arthritis and slipped discs that I've learned about, well, they're a different kind of debt. They represent bad lifting, hasty decisions, quick movements, and not paying attention to really good advice that is very, very universal and old. If you're somebody who's young, let me be another voice in the chorus to tell you that every time you put your body through a difficult and involved strain, some ice will save you now, but you are paying into an interest-bearing account, and that interest that you are accumulating will be pain.